space for conversation around women's health through the lens of naturopathic and Eastern medicine. I am Sandi Ross, and this is Her Earth Medicine Podcast. This podcast is multi-leveled. Episodes for patient education to graduate practitioner level. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you gain value from this episode. Did you know that 1 in 7 Australian women go on to develop gestational diabetes? These numbers are quite concerning, as gestational diabetes can have long-term impacts on the mother and the child. So today on the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Brittany Darling, who is a clinical nutritionist and a Western herbalist. Brittany is also a super mum of 2 and the founder of I Am Nutrients, which is a child-focused nutrient company. She's also a consulting practitioner and the founder of wholefoodhealing. Britt holds a bachelor's degree in health science in nutritional medicine and a postgraduate certificate in pediatric nutrition. She is self-declared a forever student, and she's also passionate about helping her clients with fertility, pregnancy, post-birth, and also into the early years of childhood. So let's dive in and discuss gestational diabetes. Welcome to the podcast, Brittany.
Thanks for having me, Sandi.
Thank you. Okay, Brittany, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, how you fell into being a nutritionist and into the research that you've been doing.
So, I've always wanted to be a nutritionist, which, is kind of fortunate. So, I remember my mum took me to a naturopath when I was 13 or 14. I had a whole bunch of gut issues. And basically this lady helped me, fix me, and I was just in awe of her work. And I just, from that moment onwards, after meeting her and going through the whole process of healing my gut with her, I knew exactly that's what I wanted to do. So I, started to study and still studying. So I'm currently completing my master's in human nutrition, which I have on pause at the moment just because of lots of things going on.
Yep.
With 2020,
Yep.
kids and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's kind of my background and my story.
Okay, great. So yeah, I've been following you for a while, and you've been sharing some really good research that you've been doing. I guess it's in your master's, and it's really insightful. And that's why I was so thrilled when you said yes to come on and be interviewed, because I think this area we're going to discuss, there's a lack of information out there as a resource for patients. So let's dive straight in. Can you tell us a little bit about gestational diabetes?
Okay, so like you said, there is a huge lack of information and resources out there about it, and a lot of the evidence from my research and my literature review of all the papers and all of those things, there is a huge gap in information, and there's a lot we don't know about gestational diabetes. So gestational diabetes is glucose intolerance that's first recognized in pregnancy. And that's kind of an interesting sentence, because what I find is a lot of women potentially had pre-existing either type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance before they fell pregnant, and they just didn't know about it.
Yep.
I'm seeing a lot of early diagnosis of gestational diabetes, so women sort of 16, 18 weeks of pregnancy.
Yeah.
So I do always question whether they had a pre-existing, particularly my PCOS type clients as well. So it affects 20% of pregnancies worldwide and about 1 in 7 pregnancies in Australia. So there are some risk factors for developing gestational diabetes, and one of these is a positive family history of type 2 diabetes, having hypothyroidism, as well as being overweight and obese as well is a risk factor. So that's, gestational diabetes in a nutshell. Usually, a lot of women will get their oral glucose tolerance test done around 25 to 28 weeks of pregnancy. And this is basically just to see how they handle that glucose load. So you do a fasting blood glucose, then you'll get 75 grams of glucose as a drink. And basically, they'll test your bloods 2 hours after you've had that drink. And your glucose levels should be below 10. And no, sorry, 1 hour post that drink, it should be 10, and 2 hours post that drink, it should be 8.5. So that's kind of the new diagnostic criteria for diagnosing gestational diabetes, and that is newly updated. So you're going to find that I think we're going to find our levels of gestational diabetes diagnosis is increasing, but only because the threshold for that diagnosis has been reduced. And that was actually Australian research that changed those guidelines. So that was the HAPO study, if anyone wants to look that one up.
Okay, yeah. So my cousin's a midwife, and I interviewed her last week on actually just on the first trimester of pregnancy, and she did touch on gestational diabetes. She was saying in the ward last week there was about 35 women in the maternity ward, and she reckons about half of them had gestational diabetes, and about 10 of them were actually insulin dependent. So it is definitely on the rise. And like you said, I think a lot of people go undiagnosed for a long time because there are those risk factors that do increase it. I've currently got a couple of patients that, had PCOS, and they've developed it a lot earlier on in their pregnancy. And, those risk factors are quite big. And I think they are something for people to think about when they are pregnant because, having an impact on your diet and changing things around early on can help to prevent the actual diagnosis of the gestational diabetes. So, what are some of the long-term impacts? Because I think this is a big one to discuss. If someone has gestational diabetes, what are some of the things the woman should know about what the long-term impact will be on herself and also her child?
Yeah, so for the mother, the gestational diabetes can predispose them to preeclampsia in pregnancy as well as maternal hypertension. They're more likely to end up in a C-section delivery as well as having birth trauma. So post-pregnancy, they're definitely more likely to develop type 2 diabetes as well. So this is after pregnancy. For the fetus, or rather the baby, there are a whole range of complications that can go wrong. So macrosomia, which is basically a big baby, is one of the things that can occur. And obviously that kind of ties into the birth trauma for mothers and more likely to end up in a cesarean section delivery, as well as neonatal hypoinsulinemia. So basically they have high insulin levels, as well as hypoglycemia, meaning they have low blood glucose levels when they're born. They can have shoulder dystocia as well as respiratory distress, jaundice, a whole range of things, as well as a predisposition to having metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease later in life.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that. And I do know, I think one of the risk factors for developing gestational diabetes is if you've had a previous large baby, more than 4.5 kilograms as well. So another thing to add in there. But, there's a whole host of complications that can go into it. So it is something that, like I said, I feel like there's a lack of resources around. And, if people can get the diagnosis in early and amend things, then they can really support having to have less intervention and a healthy baby basically go on to live a healthy life. Because I think the research around gestational diabetes and obesity in the child as adults, that's crazy, isn't it, to think that the impact of our blood glucose level in pregnancy can impact us later on in life. So big food for thought there to understand for patients that do have gestational diabetes, and the impact that what you can do in your pregnancy is going to be forever for your child.
Yeah, exactly. And, not just, kind of going slightly off topic with gestational diabetes, but there's this whole field of research called the DOHAD, or developmental origins of disease. And there's another really great example of how you look after yourself and what you eat during pregnancy impacts your offspring. And the best example of that is the Dutch famine. They found that there are those important developmental periods during a pregnancy that if there is a shortage of food or too much food, that it absolutely impacts the metabolic health and also, kidney health and all sorts of things for that offspring. So, the DOHAD area of study is definitely a very fast evolving area. in that space.
I mean, it just shows how important it is to look after yourself as a woman when you're pregnant.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's just say someone's done their oral glucose tolerance test. They've already had to go and see the diabetes educator. What sort of things would you recommend, like as an immediate amendment to their diet, or something they can just do straight away before they seek someone like yourself as a nutritionist?
So, so going to the diabetes educator can be an experience in itself. And I feel like the most common thing that women are told is that they need to eat more carbohydrates, and which for me just seems so counterintuitive. And I think the education should be more about increasing the quality of carbohydrates rather than the quantity, because the RDI, or the recommended amount of carbohydrates in pregnancy, should be a minimum of 175 grams per day, which, I guess without explaining exactly what that looks like. And actually on my Instagram, I have a tile that explains exactly what that looks like.
Okay, great.
It's actually not that much carbohydrate. So it's very easy to get that 175 grams of carbohydrate each day. So what I like to focus on is the quality of the carbohydrate. So instead of saying, oh, you need to have, a serve of grains with every single meal, or a serve of bread or pasta or whatever it is, I really like to hone in on the quality of that. And I always go back to the Mediterranean style diet, because that's where the best evidence is in terms of gestational diabetes. And we know in the Mediterranean diet, they eat a lot of complex carbohydrates. And this is things like whole grains. And when I say whole grains, I don't mean whole grain bread. I mean dense bread made from the whole fermented grains. So it's usually the ones in the health food store that are stored in the fridge, and they're kind of like bricks, essentially.
Brick bread,
like
yep.
Loads of bread, but they're super delicious, very nutrient dense, and a great source of these complex carbohydrates. Also legumes, so things like chickpeas and lentils, also a really good source of complex carbohydrates. Whole rolled oats, although I find that there's a small proportion of women that really don't do well with oats. And nuts and seeds as well are a great source of complex carbohydrates that are also a really dense source of nutrition. So I think, improving the quality of your carbohydrates is definitely one thing. And the other thing I like to do is to get women to either get a continuous glucose monitor, which there's ones that you can get that you pop into your arm, and there's an app on your phone, so you can continually monitor your blood glucose levels to see how you're reacting to certain foods. So like the oats ladies, the example that I used earlier, if you're going to be sensitive to oats, you can monitor your blood glucose levels and see how you go after a bowl of oats, or a bowl of oats plus some protein powder might actually be your sweet spot and mean you can tolerate it and not get that spike in blood glucose. So that would probably be my first step.
Yep. Okay. Great. With the oats, do you find that it makes a difference if they get the organic oats versus just the cheaper quality?
I think the most important thing is that they get the whole rolled oats and not the quick oats.
Okay.
So the more kind of broken down the grain, so even if it was wheat, oats, spelt, whatever it is, if it's a flour, it's going to increase your blood glucose levels much more. So quick oats, some quick oats pretty much resemble flour. So the more whole and the less adulterated that grain is, the more fibre it's going to contain, the more nutrition it's going to contain, and it's not going to spike your blood glucose as much as the flour or the refined version.
And this, I guess, is where the importance of, getting a sourdough with the fermentation to help you pre-digest those grains, because they can be heavy on the gut if you haven't been eating them. But that just takes a load off the digestive system then. Yeah,
totally. And, I didn't even talk about sugar. Well, I kind of, I just assume that my clients aren't eating sugar, refined sugar going into pregnancy either. So you want to make sure that you continue eating fruit, but whole fruit, not fruit juice. So have an apple is fine, but also pair it with some protein and don't go having juices and crazy things like that.
Okay.
And certainly not added sugars.
So immediate changes would be seek whole grains, particularly fermented forms, and cut the sugars. Yes, that's what I was looking for there too. Because I think women they're not aware of what they're eating because they're just hungry. They do require obviously more glucose, and they're tired as well, so they are going for the quick burning forms. And I think once they get the awareness and that initial shock that they do have gestational diabetes, they're more aware, which is step one, but then just making those subtle changes is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically you've got 2 weeks to turn it around before you get retested.
Yeah.
So I do work quite intensely with people and do go quite strict in that initial period. And the other thing I think that's important to talk about is getting some extra blood work done. I think the biggest mistake that we're making at the moment is that we're looking at gestational diabetes very simplistically. We're looking at it from a perspective of, it's a glucose issue, therefore we need to just look at carbohydrates. And what I'm seeing in clinic is a pattern of vitamin D deficiency. So, we know that vitamin D is really important for metabolic health, immune health, but also it's really important for the prevention of gestational diabetes and blood glucose regulation. So I'm checking their vitamin D levels. If they're craving foods, I'm absolutely checking their iron levels as well, particularly if they're really low on energy. Definitely checking their ferritin stores, which should be done around 25 weeks anyway. But there's a whole range of other bloods that I would run too to make sure that they have that nutritional adequacy and that they're not increasing their risk of GDM.
Totally. And I love that the Mediterranean diet shows up so well in the research because I think it's a very simple diet to follow. And also, we know about the microbiome and the influence that's going to have on long-term health and even the bacteria that have a role in the insulin now. It's amazing what the bacteria do. But switching from that kind of refined sugar diet to a more whole grain diet, just what that does to the diversity and the richness of the microbes is so important for health outcomes. And so, there's so much more to it than just regulating your gestational diabetes in terms of, as you said, all those other long-term health impacts that you get from changing the diet.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up the gut as well. There is some decent research on probiotic supplementation as well during pregnancy, reducing your risk of gestational diabetes too.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I love how systemic the bacteria are doing their job, and the research is really starting to prove how important they are. And we know this as naturopaths, but I think it's starting to get out there in the public now. And yeah, I think you can break it down really simple to your patients to just say you've got to eat more fibres and you've got to eat diversity of fibres.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what are some of the amendments you might make from the dietary guidelines given from a dietitian, perhaps?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on the carb one.
Yep.
I know they're big on, increasing the amount of carbohydrate that you're eating. And I feel like they don't emphasize the quality of carbohydrates enough. I'm also quite big on, making sure that my client's getting adequate protein. And so the amount of protein that you need each day is going to be individual because it's basically based on your body weight. But yeah, making sure that you're eating protein-rich foods and pairing those protein-rich foods with breakfast, lunch, dinner, and also snacks.
Mm-hmm.
And, legumes, again, like I'm obsessed with legumes, but they're also protein as well as complex carbohydrates. So they're kind of the perfect food in a way, as well as counting towards your daily vegetable requirement. Fruits and vegetables are absolutely protective and beneficial for gestational diabetes. And I think this feeds into, micronutrients. They're both rich in vitamin C and E, which have been suggested to play a role in glycemic control as well as reducing the risk of gestational diabetes. Again, they're full of fibre as well. And, yeah, basically antioxidant protection. A lot of the papers that I read did outline the role of oxidative stress as well in gestational diabetes. So fruits and veggies, antioxidants definitely play a key role in a diet for prevention of gestational diabetes and also for someone who has gestational diabetes.
Okay, awesome. Now, just going back to the legumes there, how do you recommend your pregnant women to prepare their legumes?
Yeah, so again, everyone's different. Some people actually don't tolerate legumes at all. So, but that aside, I generally recommend people to consume them. So buy dried legumes, soak them, and then cook them. If failing that, if someone can't go through that whole process, which can be a timely process, I recommend buying BPA-free tinned legumes. So we want to avoid that BPA plastic, which is the lining of tins, because we know that it's an endocrine disruptor. And it's something we absolutely want to avoid when we're trying to conceive and also when we're pregnant, because it does have health implications for the offspring. And most people kind of only become aware of BPA plastic after they've had a baby, because all of a sudden everything's labelled BPA free.
Yeah.
It's actually not allowed to be put into baby products. And, you know, quite frankly, it's kind of too late if you're only learning about it after you've had a baby.
Yeah.
You know, potentially that high level exposure during pregnancy from, you know, tin food, coffee cups, Chinese takeaway type containers, and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay. Now, what about the types and quality of the protein? Because let's just say that someone's listening to this and they really have no idea where to start with their diet, just to give them some basic food groups on where to work with, where to shop, what to do, because I think obviously the quality comes into it when we discuss protein.
Yeah, and it is important. Definitely the evidence is saying less red meat. I would say fish is going to be great, but you don't want to be having fish more than what the recommended amount is, and certainly not those bigger species, so the high mercury species like the marlin and the swordfish and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say 2 to 3 fish meals a week. I always say 3 fish meals if you're eating more than sardines, smaller fish species. But if you're having kind of salmon and tuna, sticking to those 2 serves a week. So they're a really high quality protein, high omega-3 fatty acids, which helps with the cell membrane health, which helps with glucose signaling in and outside the cell. Fish is going to be a really great protein. You know, legumes, I'm obsessed with legumes, obviously. Clearly, I'm obsessed with legumes. Less red. Eggs are also fantastic. You know, poultry is definitely going to be better than red meat. If you are going to eat red meat, I always say lean red meat if possible. You know, fat is essential in the diet. However, we do know that free fatty acids further exacerbate insulin resistance. So keeping your saturated fat intake low, but at the same time upping your healthy fats. So avocado, nuts, seeds, and 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil every single day is a key component of the Mediterranean diet.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's easily done too. And yeah, I'm loving that you're touching on fats, because I think that is one of the big protocols with the dietitians is actually of a more low-fat style diet. Yeah, and we know that fat's so important for so many things, but it's the choices of fats that you make that are going to impact on your health.
I mean, nuts and seeds as well being kind of the perfectly balanced food, being rich in protein, rich in really healthy fats, and also a source of complex carbohydrates as well. So it really does come down to food quality.
Okay, and what about the nuts and seeds? Do you recommend raw, roasted, dehydrated, activated?
Activated if you can be bothered. Otherwise, if you can afford to buy activated. But I don't like to create barriers for my clients. Obviously, I have a really wide variety of people. You know, women that are working all the way through their pregnancy, women that already have other children and busy lives, and then some women who obviously have the luxury of time and, you know, are kind of having this beautiful, relaxing pregnancy, which is, you know, incredible. And these are the women that I would sort of say, okay, well, you've got the time, let's activate some nuts and I'll show you how to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But for other women, I just don't like to create barriers. It's like, just eat nuts. They're healthy, have a handful every day. It's going to help you meet your mineral requirement. The only thing I would caution with gestational diabetes is not to have a lot of cashews. Cashews are the highest starch nut. So, you know, if I were to say, you know, not avoid, but, you know, certainly in moderation, keep the cashews low. I don't recommend roasting nuts. It just oxidizes the fats. And I also encourage people to go to one of those bulk whole food places and buy the best quality nuts they can, because I just worry about the ones sitting at Woolies and how long they've been sitting there and how long
the heat,
in the factory.
Yeah.
I think everyone's familiar with, you know, a bag of nuts that you've forgotten about in the bottom of your pantry, you know, for a couple of years, and when you open that bag and you get that rancid fat smell, they are not the nuts that you want to be eating. So fresh is certainly best when it comes to nuts and seeds.
Okay, great. Awesome. Now let's just picture, like, you know, mum of 3, pregnant with her 4th child, just being diagnosed gestational diabetes, working full time, busy. What could we kind of suggest as a day on her plate? Starting with, I know this is kind of a big question and it can go in so many ways, but just to give people a rough idea on, like, because I think that's really helpful, is what do I eat? What does a meal look like put together? Starting with, like, from when they wake up.
So, I mean, the research is saying that consuming 50% of your carbohydrate requirement in the morning has actually been shown to be really beneficial for blood glucose.
That's awesome. Yeah,
which is, you know, quite a big carbohydrate meal.
It is, yeah, because we don't do that. Especially as mothers, we all fast in the morning and then we usually get our carbs later on.
So this was a fairly, I'm trying to think of the authors. I can't think of the authors off the top of my head, but I know it was a fairly recent, like 2018, 2019 study where they compared a low carbohydrate morning to a high carbohydrate morning. And the women who had the high carbohydrate morning actually did a lot better with their blood glucose regulation. So I would probably start off with something like a porridge, but make sure it has a protein source in it. So I'm a huge fan of a birch muesli as well. So you could soak your oats in a high protein yogurt, add some nuts and seeds, add some berries. Alternatively, you could do a smoothie or something like that and just adding the oats into your smoothie. You could be doing a sprouted bread, you know, those really dense sprouted breads that I was talking about, with some eggs and spinach and mushroom. But I think the birch muesli, as a busy mum of 3 who's also pregnant and working, is kind of great because you can make a big batch once a week and kind of just scoop from it each morning. You could do a snack as well, and I'm always a fan of like veggies as snacks. So some carrot sticks and some hummus would be a pretty good snack. Otherwise, some apple with some nut butter would also be a great snack. And then moving into lunch, I'm a huge fan of legume lunches. So, and this is basically because, you know, it can be a desk drawer kind of scenario where you've got your tin of legumes, you add some baby spinach, you add some bits and pieces of veggies and some spring onion or red onion, whatever you've got on hand, add those legumes. You could also add some things for flavour, like spices, like some dukkha or, you know, whatever you've got around. Leftover roast vegetables as well, like the sweet potato, and even cold potatoes contain resistant starch and significantly less carbohydrate than cooked potatoes. So, you know, depending on your level or your extent of gestational diabetes, that could also potentially be on the cards. Otherwise, swapping out that tin legume scenario for some tin fish. So some tin salmon with the bones. I love fish with the bones because it's a dense source of calcium as well. And calcium, or reaching your calcium requirement daily, has been shown to reduce your risk of developing preeclampsia, which we know can be a concurrent complication if you have a gestational diabetes diagnosis. So, and even things like sardines, adding that to your salad would be great as well, as like a really quick lunch kind of scenario.
That's great.
And then dinners, you know, protein, veggies, brown rice, quinoa, that kind of scenario. That kind of, you know, I know that sounds pretty boring. You could be doing a pulse pasta. which is significantly higher in protein than just a regular wheat pasta as well. So you're getting that balance of fiber, protein, and complex carbohydrates. Just making sure that, every single meal that you're getting a good handful of protein. I think that's probably the most important thing, like a palm-sized portion of protein. Otherwise, if it's going to be 100% plant-based, it's going to be a whole hand-sized portion of plant-based protein.
Great. I think that's a really good picture for people to go with because, you kind of want to go off also, all right, I'm going to eat these foods, but how much? Protein is something people do need to consider because they can easily overdo it. And also with the carbs, say if they're doing brown rice, quinoa, rice, would you say half a cup of those complex carbs? What's your recommendation there per meal?
So it varies. I'm just trying to think what a serve of brown rice is. I can't think off the top of my head, but is it a quarter cup or half cup? I'm not sure, but you can always check on like nutritiondata.com and check just roughly how much carbs is in cooked brown rice, for example, just so you're tracking your carbohydrates and making sure you're not overdoing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It would be, it would take up, it depends on the size of your plate as well, but in my mind, I'm thinking it's definitely taking up less than a quarter of your plate. Half of your plate being vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, and the other quarter being a good portion of protein.
And then pour your fats all over.
Yeah, fats all over. Exactly.
Yeah.
All that delicious olive oil.
And those complex carbohydrates and the starchy, yellowish, orange kind of vegetables, they're very tonifying for the spleen in Chinese medicine. And the spleen is actually the pancreas in Chinese medicine because there is no pancreas. So that plays the role in the blood glucose monitoring. And so if someone's got a deficient spleen, we actually do recommend to eat those kinds of foods to help to tonify it, but it's always in moderation there.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? I think those traditional wisdoms are they're there, right?
Yes, definitely. And I always say there is definitely some contradictions with Chinese medicine because I've been teaching it for a few years, and as a nutritionist I can see where there's huge flaws and maybe some Chinese whispers that have come into it. But I think one of the big take-homes with gestational diabetes from like a Chinese medicine perspective would be cold foods is actually not great for your spleen because it can actually make it very deficient. It puts out our digestive fire. So like, as you said, a lot of women do salads and stuff like that when they're trying to eat healthy, but just the root veggie salads, that's a much better idea. And like avoiding the cold drinks and the smoothies and stuff like that, as that can actually make it harder for our spleen to work, which is basically making more of a challenge for regulating our blood glucose.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, we think of pregnancy as a warm condition as well, and you don't want to kind of put out that fire either. And I know postpartum traditionally, I recently learned about the confinement diet, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Oh, yes.
It's a tradition. Yeah. So, traditionally it's kind of used postpartum for the first 30 to 40 days in China, and they don't allow you to have cold foods either. It's all about warming and warming and warming. So, yeah, I think warm foods in pregnancy are definitely much better. Even though I feel like all those food examples that I gave you are more cold.
But that's all right. That's why I just thought I might add that in just to sort of tweak a few things. And
I guess you can add warming elements like, the spices that I was talking about, like cucumber to the salad, or you could add cinnamon to a birch muesli and a porridge, or cinnamon to a smoothie even.
Yeah.
Because I know earlier, before we started recording, we were talking about the benefits of herbs and spices, not only antioxidants, but also having blood glucose regulating effects. And I know in Chinese medicine you use a lot of cinnamon and ginger too.
Yeah, and there's some of the main ingredients in some of the formulas we'd prescribe for gestational diabetes. But you can certainly just use food as medicine and cook with them. And that's it. It's about just tweaking the energetic of the food. So even birch muesli is okay, but maybe just don't serve it cold from the fridge. Maybe just take it out in the morning when you wake up, sprinkle a bit of cinnamon over it, have a warm drink with it, and that might be okay. It's more like, if someone wakes up and they rush to the fridge and they take this cold thing out and then they just having straight away cold into their body, then that puts out that digestive fire. So it's about just kind of working with the temperatures and the energetics and how you can alter it. And also, where do you live in the world? Because this comes into it so much. If you're in Canada in the winter, I probably wouldn't recommend a cold birch, and maybe like you could warm that up and do a porridge. It obviously is like very different to China and Australia on the Gold Coast. So, you know, the diet you've given us an example of would be totally fine here. So people just have to also think, where in the world are they, and eat seasonally in addition to that.
Exactly. And this is another part that I really struggle with the sort of common advice for gestational diabetes. I feel like it's very geared towards a Western style diet.
Absolutely.
So I always feel for, you know, my Chinese clients or my Indian clients when they, you know, get that diagnosis and get that dietary counselling around what to eat, and it just doesn't fit in with their cultural background or how they eat at home either. And that's kind of what I love about the Mediterranean style diet. Like, obviously, you know, we think about Italy and Greece and things, but each country, you know, kind of has their own version of that.
Yes.
Culture, you know, you can kind of tie it in with, you know, the Chinese diet or even the Indian diet or a Sri Lankan diet. It's very easy to tailor that kind of advice, that kind of Mediterranean diet to all cultures.
Yes, and I think, you know, as I was saying before, I actually practiced in Bangkok in Thailand for almost 4 years. And so I worked a lot with fertility and pregnancy over there. So I've seen my fair share of gestational diabetes in Thai women and also Indian women. And I think the biggest problem there is the influence of the Western diet in those cultures. It's the sugars. It's the, you know, you've got to drink milk because it'll make your baby grow big, when traditionally they haven't been consuming dairy. So it's about actually tweaking their diet back to their traditional culture and eating like their grandparents did. And, you know, you'd see women that they had, you know, hyperemesis or something like that, and they could only eat a bowl of rice, and that's all they could tolerate. Or they could only have the iced coffees, which are pretty much half condensed milk, half sugar, and then some other like sweetened things that get added to it. And, you know, we know it's delicious. I don't know if you've ever tried one of them, but they're the worst thing possible while pregnant, especially if you have gestational diabetes. So I think going back to, you know, traditional diets, and I think the Mediterranean diet, it really fits the Western culture. We're like, oh yeah, we know what that diet is. We eat those foods. We can kind of do that. But obviously, yeah, if you're Asian, it might be more rice-based and soups and stuff like that. And if you're in South America, you're going to probably have more of your rice and beans and stuff like that. But they have lots of their good fats in the diet too. So every culture has its own way of kind of regulating things and just eating to tradition.
Yeah. I think if we would sum this up, it would be go back to your traditional diet, look at your ancestry.
Yeah.
And then
Yep.
choose your traditional diet.
Yes, and that's one thing, like with teaching Chinese medicine, I found too, is like we're trying to take a Chinese diet and apply it to Westerners. And, you know, have you heard of congee? Do you know congee?
Yeah, I know congee.
Congee. So for anyone who doesn't know, congee is a rice soup. It's basically like 1 cup of rice to 10 cups of water. So it's very easy to digest. However, you know, if it's just white rice and you're just having that with a bit of, you know, salt and pepper and spring onions, it will spike your blood glucose very quickly. So that's kind of a very traditional pregnancy consumed breakfast as well. So it is definitely something that maybe someone with an Asian background could tolerate, but, you know, if I had that for breakfast, I would be hypoglycemic in 30 minutes. So we have to alter it for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, can I just ask, what are some of the, so you touched on things like eggs and protein and whatnot, but do you think there's a few foods you could throw at us to get some of those core nutrients that people need in pregnancy? Because, you know, iron, how common is it that we're now seeing women with low ferritin and they're needing to go and get an iron infusion? It is actually crazy how many women actually needing to go and have some sort of intervention for their iron. So do you think you could maybe just dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, iron in particular, I'm seeing that too, and I do wonder whether it's a digestive thing as well, like whether they're eating too many foods high in phytic acid, which, you know, pros and cons. Phytic acid is an antioxidant, but it also binds to our minerals and reduces the absorption of them. So, you know, if you are eating too many starchy grain products, potentially, you know, you will run into iron issues with your iron levels. So, I mean, I guess for those who don't know, ferritin is what I'm primarily looking for when we order iron studies. So ferritin is the storage form of iron in the liver. And from about 25 weeks, Bubba's going to basically start sucking all your storage iron from you and accumulating it in their own liver to basically your bub's going to live off that for the first 6 months of its life, because breast milk is a really poor source of iron, which, you know, is mind-boggling. I just don't understand.
It's probably just reflected in the anemic mother.
Yeah, potentially. But yeah, so protein is probably our key macronutrient that's going to be high in iron. So again, back to those, you know, eggs, legumes are also a great source of iron if you prepare them properly. So soaking, sprouting, cooking, all of that kind of stuff. Your fish as well. So sardines are kind of my fertility, pregnancy superfood. Not everyone can tolerate them, but if you can, highly recommend consuming them because they're high in zinc, they're high in iron, they're high in omega-3 fatty acids, a whole range of essential nutrients. Tuna is also quite high in iron, but I'm usually only recommending tin tuna, solely because tin tuna is generally a smaller species.
Okay.
Just the canning process, they choose smaller species, so it's more tender. The larger species of tuna is very chewy and not very palatable in tin form. So it is lower in mercury, tin tuna. But, you know, red meat is high in iron and a really high bioavailable source of iron. So I do think that there is place for red meat in the diet, but potentially, you know, once a week. But also pairing your iron-rich meals with vitamin C-rich foods, which is basically fruits and vegetables, to make sure that you're getting the most out of your iron.
Or a bit of lime and lemon squeezed on.
Exactly. And also I've seen research on garlic and onion as well, improving iron absorption and availability as well.
Wow.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, right. Cool. Okay, and just 2 other nutrients, and I know you've discussed these on your Instagram page, just to give some food sources maybe for our listeners, just on choline and iodine.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I guess this is a bit off.
It is off topic, but I know you can do it.
Choline is like one of my favourite nutrients. And so there's, this is a kind of I feel like choline's becoming more and more popular. I'm seeing
the new folic acid.
Yeah, it's I would say it's like the sister to folic acid. So you need both of them. And, you know, choline helps with methylation, which, you know, is similar to what folic acid does as well. So it's really great for brain health as well, choline. So, and I also find it really beneficial for placental function too. So it helps with carrying nutrients across the placenta, and it also works synergistically with DHA, which is one of our long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Not a lot of prenatal multis have a good dose of choline. But food sources of choline are things like eggs, organ meats, which I always caution in pregnancy because of the high vitamin A count, high vitamin A content, which can be potentially teratogenic. Although organ meats aren't completely off the cards in pregnancy, it's more just about the amount and also the quality. So recognizing that an organ such as a liver is a filter for toxins and things in that animal's body. So if you're consuming it, you want to be pretty confident of what kind of life that animal's had.
Great point, yeah.
That it's had a very clean, organic life. What else is high in
I think cauliflower and broccoli as well. Yeah, peanuts.
Yeah, peanuts. Peanut butter is also one of my fertility superfoods. But also fish is high in choline too. So there are dietary sources, but research is kind of saying around 930 milligrams, I believe it is kind of the optimal dose during pregnancy for optimal cognitive development.
Yeah, okay.
The current adequate intake is set at 450 milligrams a day. So we're really doubling what the current recommendation is. So, it is tricky to get that full 930 milligrams through diet alone. So you can try, but, you may also need something.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think that really leads on into the postnatal brain as well. So if we have the DHA and choline sucked out of us during pregnancy because we haven't had an adequate intake, then that'll definitely show in our quality of our thoughts and thinking and our mind after having a baby. And I think it's around like 160 milligrams you get in an egg. So it is quite hard to reach that recommendation. So supplementation can be very good. But yeah.
And ask about iodine as
yes,
well.
So
iodine is probably one of my favourite nutrients. Actually, they're all my favourites. In Australia, our soil is really depleted of iodine. I'm not sure what the rest of the world is like, but I know that Australia is really, really deficient in iodine in our soil. So fruits and vegetables used to be a source, or, anything grown in an iodine-rich soil, but I think because of our farming practices, our soil is pretty depleted. So seafood is a great source of iodine, as is seaweed. But other than that, there aren't many great food sources of iodine. So I like to test my ladies' preconception, their urinary iodine concentration, to make sure that they have those adequate levels. Basically you're going to have to supplement. There should be iodine in your prenatal multi, at least 150 micrograms. And then iodine is even more important during breastfeeding. So the RDI for breastfeeding is actually higher than what it is in pregnancy. And so we go up to 270 micrograms per day of total iodine. So that, iodine is a tricky one to get. And like I said, seafood, seaweed, fortified eggs as well will have it. But the iodized sea salt is another source, but, you want to make sure that you get an iodized sea salt without the nasty anti-caking agents and stuff in it, which can be tricky to come by.
Okay, cool. Thank you for touching on them. I know they're a little off topic, but I think also if someone's got gestational diabetes and their diet hasn't been as adequate with some of the nutrients that we want in it, it's good to know what you should actually be looking out for in your, prenatals, and also adding into the diet to make sure that you stay replete so that you don't have those long-term health impacts from having deficiencies in your diet, because it's so common.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many other vitamins and minerals that are important to talk about as well, which we probably don't have time for.
Totally.
Magnesium is probably one of the key ones that we haven't touched on at all. And, magnesium helps with reducing insulin resistance. It has no actual effect on blood glucose, but it does help with that insulin resistance. And I always say the more stressed you are and the more you run around, the more you exercise, and the more you kind of have on your plate, the more likely you are to be magnesium deficient. So we just need to be replacing that magnesium as well.
Okay, great. Yes, and I think a lot of women end up with the cramps and they end up seeking help with magnesium at some point in their pregnancy. So that's a big indicator to having deficiencies, is waking up with those cramps as well.
Yeah, I actually find those cramps respond really well to a combination of magnesium and calcium.
Yes, yeah. Well, calcium is another nutrient we could dive into, isn't it? But anyways, okay, is there any last things you want to talk about with the research? Because that was, like I said, that was what really intrigued me to discuss with you. Was there any last pearls of wisdom that you found through the research in relation to gestational diabetes that you'd like to share?
Look, I think, maybe I talk about minoxidil. There is some good research on this as a supplement, and I don't recommend anyone supplements themselves. Don't get onto the iHerb and buy it and then start, dose is really important. Dose and frequency and monitoring is really important.
Totally.
Taking any supplement in pregnancy. And, everyone, if you're on metformin or if you're injecting insulin, you really want to make sure that you're doing this safely under the care of a healthcare practitioner. But basically, minoxidil is a simple carbohydrate that's given as a supplemental form when you have gestational diabetes. It can be really helpful to control the action of insulin, and also it helps with the entry of glucose into that cell. So it basically, in short, reduces blood glucose levels. So I find that as a really helpful adjunct to a, healthy, well-balanced diet to manage gestational diabetes. But if anyone wants more info, I'm happy to chat to them, via email, or I also offer a free 10-minute introductory chat as well, if they want to know more about specific things.
Okay, awesome. Yes, I love inositol. So many roles it plays. Okay, so what would be the take-home message for dietary implications for someone with gestational diabetes in a nutshell?
Eat enough protein, get your vitamin D levels checked, complex carbohydrates, so quality over quantity. I guess Mediterranean style diet. I don't know, I can't narrow it down.
I'll just add in, just maybe cut out the refined sugars.
Yes, totally, yes.
Yeah.
Any added sugar have to go, and any excessive fruit intake
yeah.
as well needs. So anything more than 2 to 3 serves is too much.
Yeah, and because sometimes these women are actually eating a really good diet, it's just those extra things like that chocky bar in the afternoon, the can of Coke or the soft drink, because they're wanting that little...
Or the honey in every single cup of coffee or chai tea.
Yeah, yep. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brittany. You've given us so much insight in this podcast. Where can our listeners find you?
So you can find me on Instagram. I'm at wholefoodhealing. I also have my website, wholefoodhealing.com.au, and my clinic is based in Sydney.
And you offer online consultations, don't you?
Yeah, I do. So, since COVID, thanks COVID, I now have a virtual practice as well as face-to-face practice. So, I've been seeing clients all over the world, actually, since March. So that's been really interesting and very rewarding as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. So if everyone wants to check out Brittany's details, I'll make sure to pop them all in the show notes so that you can access her. And also, do not self-prescribe. This is where you do need to seek out professional help, and she's definitely one of the gurus in the field at the moment. So thank you again, Brittany, and hopefully we can have you back on for a later chat on some of those other key nutrients.
Thanks, Sandi.
Thanks, Brittany. Thank you for listening. I have been a practitioner of naturopathic and Chinese medicine for over a decade. I have a master's degree of health science, and I am an academic lecturer at Australia's leading natural medicine college. I am available worldwide online for bookings. Simply go to sandirothhealth.com.